What is a man? Once you take away his face, not his fortune, not his name upon a door, but the very features by which the world knows him. Imagine a stranger arriving at your threshold at 3 a.m, blind, mute, and utterly faceless, clutching only a scrap of paper with one word scrawled upon it: face. This is not a ghost story, though it will chill you like one. It is the case of a man erased, and of how far one mind will go to remember what another was paid to forget. Settle by the fire, then. Sherlock Holmes has never faced a mystery quite like this one. Chapter 1. The Uninvited Face. There are those who imagine that the life of a consulting detective must be a procession of daylight incidents: a stolen necklace at noon, a forged will discussed over afternoon tea. I can attest, from long years at Sherlock Holmes's side, that the truest horrors of London prefer the small hours, when the gas lamps gutter low and the city's conscience, such as it is, lies sleeping. It was in just such an hour, the third after midnight, by the chiming of the clock on the mantel, that the case I am about to relate first darkened our door. I had been roused not by any sound from the street, but by the peculiar silence that follows one. Holmes, I discovered upon coming down in my dressing gown, was already at the window, his violin set aside, his pipe cold in his hand. "You heard it too, Watson," said he, without turning. "Or rather, you heard the absence of it. A cab stopped below some 3 minutes since, and no one has yet rung. Perhaps they thought better of the hour. Or perhaps," Holmes said quietly, "they are afraid to knock, and yet more afraid to leave." As if in answer to his words, the bell sounded, not the brisk, decisive pull of a confident visitor, but a faint, trembling summons, as though the hand upon it scarcely had the strength or the will to complete the motion. I heard Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stair below, a murmured exclamation, and then silence. Holmes was already moving. I followed him down, my heart quickening with that particular unease which long acquaintance with strange cases had taught me to respect rather than dismiss. Mrs. Hudson stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her breast, her candle throwing long shadows up the papered wall. She did not speak. She had no need to. Beyond her, framed in the darkness of the open door, stood the visitor. I have set down in these memoirs sights that would try the composure of any man: the swollen, discolored face of a strangled woman, the ruin left by a tiger's claws, the horror of a man dead of an unnamed Asian poison, his features locked in a rictus of final agony. I tell you honestly that none of these prepared me for the sight of that figure on our step. He was dressed as a gentleman of means. A well-cut coat, dark trousers, a silk cravat gone slightly askew, and yet his shoes, I noted even in that first shock, were of a coarser, cheaper leather, entirely unsuited to the rest of his attire, as if he had been dressed by another's hand in haste, or had exchanged some article of his own clothing along the way. He was of middle height, perhaps 45 years of age, his hair grey at the temples, his hands, and this struck me with a physician's eye even in that first instant, soft and uncalloused, the hands of a scholar, but it was his face that stopped the breath in my throat. Where a man's features ought to be, the deep sockets of the eyes, the ridge of the nose, the mobile architecture of the mouth, there was instead an unbroken plane of pale, smooth skin, not scarred, not bandaged, not masked, simply smooth, as an egg is smooth, as though some vast and patient hand had drawn a thumb across wet clay and left no feature standing. There was breath. I could see his chest rise and fall in evident distress, and there was, God help me, an unmistakable air of terror about the man, communicated wholly through the set of his shoulders and the trembling of his hands, for he had no eyes to widen, no mouth to cry out. "Good God," I said, and I confess the words left me before I could summon anything more useful. Holmes did not recoil. I have seen him face down armed lunatics and coiled serpents with less outward change of expression than most men show at a dull sermon, and he did not fail me now, though I saw, in the flare of the gas jet as Mrs. Hudson at last found her hand to light it fully, that even his composure had been shaken, if only for the length of a single indrawn breath. "Bring him in, Mrs. Hudson, and stir the fire," said he. "Watson, your bag, if you please. Gently, sir. You are among friends." The visitor did not resist, as we drew him within and settled him into the basket chair nearest the hearth. But neither did he seem wholly to understand the kindness offered him. His hands moved restlessly over his own knees, patting, as a blind man's might, though I would learn within the hour that his blindness, if such it could be called, was of a piece with the rest of his terrible affliction. When Holmes spoke to him directly, asking his name, his business, the manner of his arrival, the man made no reply of any kind, no sound, no gesture of comprehension, save that his hands ceased their restless motion and pressed suddenly and violently over the place where his ears should have been, as though the very sound of a human voice caused him pain past bearing. "He cannot hear you as we hear," I said slowly, examining what passed for his temple. "Or rather, Holmes, look here. There is no canal, no external ear at all, only this same smoothness. And yet he came," Holmes murmured, "by cab, at 3 in the morning, to this specific address, at number 221B, Baker Street. A blind, deaf, mute man does not summon a hansom by chance, Watson, nor direct it to so particular a door." It was at this point that Mrs. Hudson, with the steadiness I have always admired in her, and which I suspect she does not admire sufficiently in herself, discovered the paper. It had been clutched in the visitor's right hand so tightly that the knuckles had gone white, and it was only when she gently unfolded his fingers, murmuring some soft maternal reassurance as she might to a frightened child, that the small, crumpled scrap came free. Holmes took it to the lamp. I looked over his shoulder. Upon the paper, in a hand so shaken and uneven that the letters seemed almost to totter upon the page, was written a single word: face. "A message," I said, "or a plea, or a warning," said Holmes, turning the paper over, holding it to the light at an angle, running one long finger along the indentations left by the pen's pressure. "Observe, Watson, the depth of the strokes. Here, in the downward stem of the F, the paper is nearly torn through, while the crossbar is scarcely visible at all. This was not written by a calm hand recording an instruction. This was written in extremity, in terror, or in triumph, and I do not yet know which." I confess that in that moment I thought of ghost stories told round winter fires, of the folk who claim that the dead walk at such an hour bearing the marks of their undoing, and I said something to that effect, half in jest, half, I own it now, in genuine unease. Holmes's grey eyes, when they turned to mine, held none of my superstitious dread, but neither, I thought, did they hold his customary certainty. There is nothing supernatural in a man's face, Watson, however strange its absence. There is a cause, as there is a cause for all things, and we shall find it. But I tell you frankly, and I do not say this lightly, that in 25 years of such investigations, I have never yet encountered a problem that so thoroughly refuses to declare, at the very outset, what manner of problem it is. Watson, examine his hands, if you please. His condition, I do not think it congenital. I did as he asked, and found upon closer inspection what I might have expected. No birth defect this, no accident of nature, but, I would have staked my medical reputation on it even then, the mark of some deliberate and calculated act, though by what conceivable method a face might be removed, rather than merely disfigured, I could not then have said. "His face, Holmes," I said at last, my voice not quite steady. "Where is his face?" Holmes was silent a long moment, watching the stranger's restless, patting hands, the terrible smooth blankness, turned toward the fire as though seeking a warmth it could not see. When he spoke, it was with a gravity I had seldom heard from him. "That, my dear Watson, is the very least of the mysteries he presents. The true question is, where is his memory?" Chapter 2. The Echo of a Memory. Dawn found our visitor asleep, or in some state resembling sleep, in the small chamber Holmes keeps for such emergencies, with Mrs. Hudson installed at his bedside, bearing broth and an expression of such fierce, unspoken tenderness that I understood, not for the first time, that our landlady possessed depths her modest station rarely permitted her to display. I learned later, and it is worth recording here, though it comes properly earlier in her history than in mine, that she had, in her youth, nursed soldiers home from foreign campaigns, men whose wounds were not always visible upon the skin, and that something in the stranger's silent, patient terror had called back to her those years entire. Holmes, meanwhile, had not slept at all. I found him at 7 o'clock, exactly as I had left him, save that the ashtray at his elbow had grown considerably fuller, and a fresh telegram lay upon the table. "I have wired every hospital, asylum, and police surgeon within 20 miles, said he, describing our guest's condition in the plainest terms I could manage, though I confess plain terms feel inadequate to so singular a case. I have also," he added, with the faint, dry satisfaction he reserves for his own cleverness, "wired Cambridge." Cambridge? Why Cambridge of all places? Because, Watson, a man's coat tells a story his ruined face cannot. The cut is some 3 years old by the wear at the cuffs, but the tailor's mark, I found it stitched within the lining, half unpicked, as though someone had tried and failed to remove all evidence of its origin, is that of a firm in Trinity Street. Cambridge tailors do not, as a rule, dress bankers or barristers. They dress dons. Our answer came by early afternoon, and it came not by telegram, but in the person of a young woman whose arrival I shall not soon forget. She was perhaps 28, dressed with the plain neatness of a schoolmistress, her dark hair drawn back severely, and her eyes, when Holmes had shown her, with what gentleness he could muster, into the sitting-room where the stranger now sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire, filled at once with a recognition so absolute, so instantaneous, that I knew before she spoke a single word that our mystery had found its name. "Father," she said, and the single syllable broke upon a sob she could not entirely master. "Oh, father, what have they done to you?" She was Miss Cecily Finch, a teacher at a girls' school in Kensington, and the man before us, she left no room for doubt upon this point, weeping now openly as she took his unresisting, patting hands in her own, was her father, Professor Aldrich Finch, formerly of Trinity College, Cambridge, vanished without trace or explanation some 12 months previous. "They told us he must have drowned," she said, when Holmes had settled her with tea and the particular steady patience he reserves for witnesses in genuine distress. There was a search of the river, of the fens, near his old family home, of every asylum and workhouse for 2 counties. My mother died 8 months ago, Mr. Holmes, still believing he would walk through our door one evening, as though he had merely lost his way home from the library. I confess I had begun, God forgive me, to believe he was dead, and to grieve him as such. "And yet he lives," said Holmes gently, "though not, I think, as you knew him. Tell me of your father, Miss Finch, not of his disappearance, but of the man himself. What manner of scholar was he? What were his passions, his habits, the small particulars by which those who loved him would have known him in a crowd of strangers?" It was, I have since reflected, a masterstroke of interviewing, for grief loosens the tongue, where interrogation only tightens it. And Miss Finch spoke for the better part of an hour, her voice steadying as she found, in memory, a refuge from the horror before her. She told us of a man devoted beyond reason to his books. A specialist, she said, in the ancient and medieval history of the English royal line. A scholar whose memory for dates, names, and obscure charters was, in her own words, like a steel trap. He forgot nothing, Mr. Holmes, nothing at all, and it was both his great gift, and I sometimes thought, his great burden, for he could not forget a slight any more than he could forget a fact of history. She told us, too, of his laugh, sudden and booming, incongruous in so precise a man, and of small habits, his fondness for a particular blend of pipe tobacco scented faintly of cherry, his insistence upon walking each morning along the backs regardless of weather, his correspondence, in his final months, grown strange and secretive, conducted with men whose names she did not recognize, and did not, she thought now with evident unease, entirely trust. He had discovered something, she said slowly, as though the thought had only now assembled itself fully in her mind. In the weeks before he vanished, he was not frightened precisely, but guarded, as I had never known him. He burned letters in the grate, Mr. Holmes, which he had never done in all my life, and once, when I asked him directly what troubled him, he said only that some truths, once uncovered, could not safely be set down upon paper, for paper could be read by eyes other than one's own. Holmes had been very still throughout this recitation, his eyes half closed in the attitude I had learned to recognize as his most intense concentration. But at this he opened them fully. And did he give any indication, Miss Finch, of the subject of this dangerous truth? Only once. He said, and I confess I thought it at the time some scholar's flight of fancy, that he had found evidence the royal line itself rested upon a forged foundation stone, laid centuries since, and never questioned, because none dared question it. He said the men who guarded that stone would go to any length to see it stand unshaken. I own that I found this claim, at first hearing, difficult to credit, the stuff of romances rather than of sober Cambridge scholarship, but Holmes did not dismiss it, and I have learned to trust his instincts in such matters, above my own skepticism. It was while Miss Finch spoke that I turned my attention, as a physician rather than a detective, to a matter that had been troubling me since our first examination of the stranger some hours before. I had, at Holmes's earlier suggestion, collected a small sample of moisture from the corner of what remained of the professor's face, for he wept, though he had no eyes as we understand them, some faint secretion escaping still from beneath that terrible smoothness, and I had subjected it, with the aid of my small traveling chemical case, to such tests as the hour and my equipment allowed. "Holmes," I said, when Miss Finch had at last been persuaded to rest in the adjoining room, "I have found something in his tears that I cannot immediately place. There is an alkaloid present, faint but unmistakable, of a character I do not recognize from any pharmacopoeia I have studied. It is not laudanum nor any preparation of opium. It bears some faint resemblance to certain preparations I encountered during my service in Afghanistan, brought west by traders from further Asia, but the resemblance is imperfect." Holmes took the small vial from my hand and held it to the light with the intensity of a man handling a relic. "This," said he softly, "is no longer a mystery of disguise, Watson, nor of accident, nor even, I begin to suspect, of simple violence. A man does not lose his face to a blow, nor to a fever, nor to the malice of a jealous rival, however Miss Finch's account might tempt us toward that easy explanation." He set the vial down with exaggerated care, as though it might yet do harm merely by existing upon our table. This was not a simple assault. This was a purpose-built attack upon the very architecture of his consciousness, engineered, Watson, by someone possessed of both a chemist's precision and a scholar's patience. We are looking for a man of immense learning, and profound cruelty. A physician gone mad, perhaps, or some foreign poisoner. "I do not yet know who," Holmes said, rising and crossing to the window, where the grey afternoon light fell across his sharp, thoughtful features. "But I begin to suspect I know what. Not a crime of passion, Watson, nor of greed, nor even, in the narrow sense, of politics. Something older and colder than any of these." Miss Finch spoke of a forged foundation stone that certain men would preserve at any cost. I think we must ask ourselves not merely who attacked her father, but why history itself should require a guardian, and what manner of men believe they have appointed themselves its executioners instead. He turned from the window, and in the failing light his face wore an expression I had seen upon it only rarely. Not the keen delight of a puzzle half solved, but something graver, more searching, as though he had glimpsed, in the shape of this case, some shadow larger than its immediate particulars. "We shall begin, I think, with Cambridge," said he. "There is a rival, is there not?" Miss Finch mentioned. "Some colleague with whom her father quarrelled. A convenient suspect, Watson, and I distrust convenient suspects almost as heartily as I distrust convenient coincidences. But we must follow every thread, however it seems to lead, until we find the one that does not fray in our hands." Chapter 3. The Cabinet of Forgotten Minds. I had thought, in my innocence, that a night's rest might restore some sense of ordinary proportion to the affair, but I woke the following morning to find that the case had, if anything, grown stranger in the interval, and that Holmes had not troubled himself with sleep at all. "You will be pleased to know," said he, as I entered our sitting-room to find him already dressed and breakfasted, a stack of correspondence before him, that Professor Aldrich Finch possessed, in addition to his scholarly virtues, at least one enemy of long standing. A Dr. Josiah Weatherby, Fellow of St. Cuthbert's, with whom our missing Don conducted a public and rather undignified quarrel in the pages of the Cambridge Historical Review, some 18 months past, on the subject. You will find this either dull or significant, Watson, according to your temperament, of a disputed charter purporting to establish certain rights of primogeniture in the 12th century. A scholarly dispute seems a thin motive for so monstrous a crime. Thin, perhaps, but not therefore false. Men have murdered one another over slighter provocations than wounded academic pride, and I do not discount Dr. Weatherby merely because his motive seems, to your sensible mind, disproportionate to the horror of the act. We shall speak with him directly. But first, and here Holmes rose, drawing on his coat with the brisk energy that always overtook him at the true commencement of an investigation, "I have had word from Trinity College that Professor Finch's rooms have stood untouched these 12 months, at his daughter's particular and, I gather, rather forcefully expressed insistence. We shall go there before we go anywhere else, for a man's private chamber tells truths his public quarrels conceal." We took the morning train to Cambridge, and I confess that the journey, through flat, fog-wreathed fenland country, the sky the colour of a healing bruise, did little to lighten my spirits. Holmes spoke scarcely at all, his eyes fixed upon the passing landscape, though I knew from long acquaintance that behind that abstracted gaze his mind moved with a rapidity I could never hope to match. Professor Finch's rooms, when at last we were admitted to them by an elderly and visibly nervous porter, presented a scene of scholarly disorder, frozen, as it were, at the precise moment of its owner's vanishing. Books lay open upon the desk, their pages yellowing now with a year's undisturbed dust. A pipe rested in a saucer beside a dried inkwell, and upon the walls, in framed prints and hand-drawn genealogical charts, hung the visible evidence of a mind wholly given over to the untangling of England's ancient and tangled bloodlines. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes, moving methodically about the chamber with that peculiar crouching, cat-like attention he brings to a fresh scene. "The great." I looked, and saw what I ought perhaps to have expected from Miss Finch's account. A heap of paper ash, long undisturbed, but sufficient in quantity to suggest that a considerable quantity of correspondence had been destroyed in that hearth, and destroyed, moreover, in evident haste, for several half-burnt fragments remained at the edges where the flame had not fully done its work. Holmes knelt and, with the delicate care of a man handling a wounded bird, lifted one such fragment upon the flat of a letter-opener and carried it to the window's light. "Here," said he softly, "Chimerian Order does not forego." He turned the scrap this way and that. "And here, upon this second fragment, the past is a shackle we must at last." "Chimerian," I said, reading over his shoulder. "What manner of word is that?" "I do not yet know, though I intend to find out before this day is done. It has the ring of the classical about it. Chimera, Watson, the beast of Greek fable, lion and goat and serpent, fused into one impossible form. A fitting name, perhaps, for an organization that fuses fact and falsehood until neither retains its original shape." He set the fragment down with great care upon the desk, as though it were evidence in the truest sense, and continued his search of the room. "It was I, in fact, who made the next discovery, though I own it was more by chance than by any deductive gift. A small leather-bound diary, fallen or perhaps deliberately thrust behind the loose skirting board beside the fireplace, where it had evidently lain undisturbed by whatever hands had searched these rooms before us. Holmes!" He was at my side in an instant, and together we turned the diary's pages by the grey window light. Most of the entries were unremarkable: notes on lectures given, complaints of college politics, small domestic matters concerning Cecily's schooling, but the final dozen pages, written in a hand grown progressively more cramped and hurried, told a different story entirely. "They meet at the old chapel on Sundry Lane," one entry read, "though they call themselves scholars and antiquarians, and I confess I believed them such myself until I understood the true purpose of their researches. They do not study history to preserve it, but to determine which portions of it may safely be erased." Another, dated some 10 days before his disappearance, "I have found the forged instrument at last, the very stone upon which the whole edifice rests, and I understand now why T has been so insistent that I abandon my inquiry. He is not merely a colleague in this matter, he is, I begin to fear, its architect." "T," I said, "Weatherby's initial, surely." "Perhaps," said Holmes, though something in his tone suggested he was not wholly persuaded, "or perhaps a more common initial than we should like, in a university so thoroughly populated with gentlemen whose surnames begin with that letter. We must not fasten upon the obvious candidate merely because he presents himself first, Watson. That is the surest way to walk directly into whatever trap has been laid for us." We found, upon the diary's final legible page, a single further entry, undated, written in a hand so agitated that several words were nearly illegible. "If this is found, and I am not, know that I have gone to seek the one man in England whose reasoning even they cannot corrupt or anticipate. S.H. Baker Street. God willing I reach him before they reach me." I confess a chill passed through me at this, for it meant that Professor Finch, or whatever remained to him of will and purpose in that final extremity, had known, a full year before his ruined arrival upon our step, that Sherlock Holmes might one day be his only recourse. "Then he intended to come to you long before he ever did," I said. "Why the delay of a year, Holmes? If he knew the danger, why not come directly?" "That, my dear Watson, is a question I cannot yet answer, though I suspect the answer, when we find it, will prove more terrible than the question itself." He closed the diary carefully and placed it within his coat. "Come, we have Dr. Weatherby yet to interview, and I think, moreover, that we ought to examine the chemical evidence you gathered against whatever curious substances Cambridge's own Department of Natural Science might identify." Our interview with Dr. Weatherby proved, as Holmes had half predicted, a disappointment to any theory of simple academic murder. We found him a stooped, ink-stained, entirely unremarkable little man, indignant at Finch's memory rather than guilty of any hand in his fate, and possessed, moreover, of an alibi so thoroughly documented. He had been lecturing in Edinburgh, before some 40 witnesses, on the very week of Finch's disappearance, that Holmes abandoned the line of inquiry within a quarter-hour of its commencement. "A dead end?" I said, as we walked back toward the station through streets grown dim with the day's early dusk, and a full day spent upon it. "Not entirely dead, Watson. A red herring, properly examined, often reveals more of the true shape of a case than a fresh clue does, for it tells us what the truth is not, and narrows thereby the ground upon which it must stand. We know now that this is no mere quarrel between rival scholars. We know that Finch believed himself pursued by an organization, not an individual, and that he named it the Chimerian Order, in terms that suggest both antiquity and purpose. And we know, from the chemical trace in his tears, that whoever executed this crime against him possessed knowledge that lies at the very furthest edge of Western pharmacology. It was as we crossed toward the platform that Holmes stopped abruptly, his hand upon my sleeve, his eyes fixed upon a small item embedded in the mud beside the curb, a fleck of unusual green, almost the color of verdigris, clinging to the heel of a workman's discarded boot, cast aside near the station wall. "Watson, your penknife, if you please." He scraped a portion of the strange green substance into a small paper twist, examining it with the particular fascination he reserves for the seemingly trivial. "Clay," he pronounced at last, "but of a character I have not often encountered in this part of England. Too fine, too uniformly green, to be common Cambridgeshire soil. This is riverine clay, Watson, of the sort found in quantity along certain reaches of the Thames far to the east, where the old docks and warehouses give way to poorer, more forgotten quarters of the city." He straightened, folding the twist of paper carefully into his notebook. "I begin to suspect, my friend, that our investigation must return to London, and to a rather less reputable part of it than Baker Street." Chapter 4. The Man with the Ball of String. We returned to London that same evening to find the professor considerably restored in bodily strength, though no nearer, in any outward sense, to a restoration of mind or speech. Mrs. Hudson reported that he had eaten with something approaching appetite, had slept through much of the day, and had, on one occasion, started violently from his rest at the sound of the church bells of St. Marylebone tolling the hour, pressing his hands once more to the smooth places where his ears should have been, as though the sound itself were an assault. "He fears bells," I observed, recording the fact in my notebook with the diligence of a physician building a case history. "He fears," said Holmes, "reminders of time. Consider it, Watson. A man robbed of memory exists in a perpetual and terrible present, for the tolling of an hour can mean nothing to one who cannot recall the hour that preceded it, save as a fresh assault upon a mind already stripped bare. It is, I think, among the cruelest imaginable tortures, and I begin to suspect it was inflicted with exactly that cruelty in mind, rather than as the incidental consequence of some more ordinary crime. The green clay, traced through certain of Holmes's less reputable but more useful acquaintances among the rivermen and mudlarks of the Thames, led us within 2 days to Limehouse, and to a low, damp establishment, styling itself the Limehouse Charitable Retreat for the Afflicted in Mind, a private asylum of the sort that exists, as I have had occasion to observe in the course of my medical career, at the shadowed margin between genuine charity and genuine profit, catering to families anxious to remove some embarrassing relative from public view with a minimum of awkward inquiry. We approached it disguised, Holmes as a visiting alienist from the North Country seeking to place a troublesome elderly relation, myself as his silent and deferential colleague, and were received by a brother alderman, a soft-spoken, grey-cassocked clergyman of perhaps 50 years, whose manner struck me, even before Holmes's later analysis confirmed my instinct, as subtly, indefinably wrong. "We minister to the forgotten of this world," said Brother Alderman, leading us through corridors that smelled of carbolic, and, beneath it, of something danker and less wholesome, those whom the ordinary world has, in its impatience, set aside. "It is holy work, gentlemen, though I confess the world rewards it poorly." "You minister to many such unfortunates?" Holmes inquired, in the mild, faintly credulous tone he had adopted for our disguise. "A dozen at present, though our numbers vary. Some recover, in time, some small measure of themselves. Others," and here the clergyman's soft face arranged itself into an expression of practiced sorrow, "remain, alas, beyond our poor arts to heal, and find in this house merely a peaceful harbour for whatever years remain to them." I observed, as we passed along the corridor, several of these unfortunates through half-open doors, men and women seated in attitudes of profound vacancy, neither distressed nor at peace, but simply absent, in a manner that recalled, with a chill I could not suppress, the terrible blankness of Professor Finch's ruined countenance, though none among them had suffered his particular physical affliction. Their faces remained intact. It was something behind the faces that seemed to have been extinguished. "Shell shock," I murmured to Holmes, when Brother Alderman's attention was momentarily elsewhere, "or something resembling it. I saw such cases among soldiers returned from foreign campaigns, men present in body, absent in every faculty that makes a man himself. And yet these are not soldiers, Watson, but, if my suspicion holds, scholars, gentlemen, perhaps even ladies of quality, whose families found it more convenient to consign them to Brother Alderman's tender care than to seek too closely into the cause of their affliction. It was the Baker Street irregulars, that ragged and invaluable company of street children whom Holmes employs, where official constables would only announce their presence and defeat their own purpose, who provided our next and most striking piece of intelligence. A boy named Wiggins, no more than 9 years of age, had spent 2 days loitering about the Limehouse establishment under Holmes's earlier instruction, and presented himself at Baker Street that evening with a grubby scrap of paper bearing a child's drawing. A figure, crudely rendered, possessed of arms and legs and a coat much like any other man's, but where the face should have been, only a tangle of scrawled lines, round and round, like, the boy explained, with the perfect unself-conscious honesty of childhood, "a ball of string, sir, on account of I couldn't rightly draw what weren't there." "He has seen another," Holmes said quietly, examining the drawing with an intensity that belied its crude execution. "There is more than one victim of this affliction, Watson, and our child artist, lacking the vocabulary to describe what he witnessed, has nonetheless captured its essential horror with more precision than any adult report could offer." Wiggins pressed further, reported also that Brother Alderman had been observed, on the previous evening, entering not the asylum but a private and altogether more distinguished establishment in St. James's, a gentleman's club of the sort that admits no member without extensive credentials of birth or scholarship. "The Athenaeum," Holmes said, when the boy had named the place and been sent off with his shilling and Mrs. Hudson's grateful attentions regarding a plate of cold beef. He rose from his chair with the sudden, coiled energy I had learned to recognize as the sign of a mind that has glimpsed, if not yet grasped, the true shape of its quarry. "That is not a place for clergymen, Watson, whatever collar our Brother Alderman affects to wear. That is a club for historians, antiquarians, fellows of learned societies, men, in short, of precisely the scholarly distinction that Professor Finch himself once possessed, and that his diary suggested his persecutors possess also. You believe Brother Alderman a member? I believe, said Holmes slowly, moving to the window and looking out upon the darkening street with an expression I had rarely seen upon his sharp features, something almost approaching apprehension, that our clergyman is no clergyman at all, but an agent sent to complete some unfinished business regarding Professor Finch, to ensure, perhaps, that whatever fragments of memory the professor retains are extinguished before they can be of use to us. And I believe, moreover, that the true architect of this conspiracy does not skulk in the shadows of Limehouse, but sits, at this very hour, in the warm and well-lit comfort of one of London's most respectable institutions, dining, very possibly, upon an excellent claret, and congratulating himself upon the thoroughness of his own erasures. I confess a certain dread settled upon me at these words, for I understood, even before Holmes gave it fuller expression, that we stood now upon the threshold of something considerably larger and more dangerous than the disappearance of a single Cambridge don, that we had, in fact, only begun to glimpse the outer edge of a conspiracy whose full dimensions neither of us yet comprehended, and whose members numbered, quite possibly, among the very pillars of respectable society, that a lesser detective would never think to suspect. We must discover this order's true membership, I said, and swiftly, before Brother Alderman, or whoever commands him, thinks to move against the professor again. We must do more than that, Watson. Holmes turned from the window, and in the lamplight his face held an expression of grim and settled purpose. We must discover what it is they truly fear the professor might yet remember, for I do not think this conspiracy was ever truly concerned with the erasure of one man's face. I think it concerned, from its very inception, with the erasure of a truth so dangerous that an entire institution of learned men judged it safer to destroy a colleague's mind than to permit that truth to stand. Chapter 5. The Chimera's Inkwell. There are those days in any investigation, and I have observed them recur in case after case throughout our long association, when progress ceases to announce itself through dramatic incident, and instead accumulates slowly, silently, through hours of patient and largely joyless labor. Such were the 3 days that followed our visit to Limehouse, during which Holmes all but abandoned his customary habits of eating and rest in favor of the great domed reading room of the British Museum, where he sat from the hour of opening until the attendants, with many apologetic murmurs, ushered him out each evening among the last of the departing scholars. I confess I grew genuinely alarmed for his health during this period, for I had seen him drive himself to such extremities before, in cases of lesser moment, and knew the toll it exacted upon a constitution already worn thin by irregular habits and the peculiar nervous intensity of his temperament. He ate, when he ate at all, standing, and answered my inquiries after his welfare with an impatience that would have wounded me deeply had long acquaintance not taught me to recognize it as the outward symptom of a mind wholly consumed by its quarry, rather than any want of regard for my concern. The word Chimerian, said he, on the evening of the second day, when I had at last persuaded him to take a proper supper at Baker Street, is not, as I first suspected, a modern coinage adopted for dramatic effect. I have traced it this afternoon to a footnote, a single footnote, Watson, in a volume so obscure that I believe I am only the third reader to have requested it from the museum's vaults in 40 years, appended to a 19th-century translation of a lost Hellenistic text on the philosophy of memory. A philosophy of memory? I did not know such a thing existed. Few do, which is precisely why it serves so admirably as the foundation of a secret society. The original text, attributed to a minor and largely discredited philosopher of the Alexandrian school, argues that memory itself constitutes a plague upon mankind, that man's endless capacity to recall old grievances, old wars, old wrongs, perpetuates every cruelty from one generation to the next, and that true peace, true freedom from the tyranny of the past could be achieved only through the deliberate and systematic unmaking of memory, both individual and collective. He paused, and I saw in the gaslight that his face had grown unusually pale. The footnote records that a small circle of Renaissance scholars, having rediscovered this text, adopted for themselves the name Chimerian, after the beast of legend, formed of parts that ought never naturally combine, and dedicated themselves, in secret, to the practical pursuit of this philosophy across succeeding centuries. I set down my fork, my appetite for the moment quite gone. "You are telling me, Holmes, that Professor Finch fell victim not to some passing lunatic or ordinary criminal gang, but to an organization with a documented history stretching back centuries. I am telling you that such an organization claims such a history, which is not quite the same thing, though I have found nothing thus far to contradict the claim. And I am telling you further, Watson, that this footnote, buried, as I say, in a volume that scarcely a handful of scholars in England have troubled to open in half a century, suggests a level of obscurity, of deliberate concealment, that speaks to genuine and long-sustained purpose rather than the passing enthusiasm of a modern crank. It was on the third day, while Holmes pursued this thread yet further into the museum's darker corners of scholarship, that I made a discovery of my own. One, I confess, gave me no small satisfaction, for I have sometimes felt, in the course of our partnership, that my own contributions run to the merely supportive, the dutiful chronicling of another man's genius, and it pleased me to feel, upon this occasion, that I had earned my place at Holmes's side through my own faculties rather than his generosity. I had taken it upon myself to review, systematically, the catalogue of works upon the subject of medieval English royal genealogy, the very subject, Miss Finch had told us, of her father's dangerous final researches, and had noted, with the methodical patience Holmes has so often praised in principle, and so rarely practiced himself, a curious pattern in the museum's lending records. No fewer than 11 volumes touching upon the disputed 12th century charters of succession had been withdrawn from circulation over the preceding 18 months, each upon the signature of the same borrower, and each, this was the detail that struck me most forcibly, never returned, the museum's own records showing them written off, at the borrower's expense, as lost. The name upon each withdrawal slip was the same: Prof. Emeritus S. Thornfield, Department of Antiquities, Cambridge. I brought this discovery to Holmes that same evening with an eagerness I did not trouble to disguise, and watched with some pride as his weary countenance sharpened at once into full attention. "Thornfield," he repeated slowly, taking the list of withdrawn volumes from my hand and studying it with care. "I know the name, Watson, though I confess I had not yet placed it within our present investigation. Silas Thornfield, a scholar of very considerable reputation, I believe, and no small personal fortune, who has served for some years upon the governing council of the Royal Society, and who is spoken of, in the circles that concern themselves with such matters, as among the foremost living authorities upon English medieval documents." "A respectable man, then." "The most respectable of men, Watson, which is precisely why I find your discovery so profoundly disquieting." He set the list down and rose to pace before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, in the attitude that always accompanied his most concentrated thought. "Consider the pattern with me. Professor Finch, by his own diary, discovered evidence that the royal line rests upon a forged foundation, a forged medieval charter, we may reasonably suppose, given the subject of his researches. He names an unidentified T. as the architect of the conspiracy against him, and now we find that 11 volumes touching upon precisely this subject have been systematically withdrawn from public access by a scholar whose surname begins with that self-same initial. You suspect Thornfield of Finch's affliction. I suspect Thornfield, said Holmes carefully, of knowing considerably more of this affair than an innocent scholar ought to know. Whether he is himself the hand that wielded the poison, or merely, as I begin increasingly to suspect, its directing intelligence, working through agents, such as our brother Alderman, I cannot yet say with certainty. But I tell you frankly, Watson, that I have rarely felt, in the whole of my career, so pronounced a sense that I am approaching not merely a criminal, but a mind of very nearly my own caliber, applied to purposes I find increasingly difficult to contemplate without a certain cold unease. It was, I think, the first occasion upon which I heard Holmes speak of an adversary in terms that acknowledged, however obliquely, the possibility of his own defeat, and I own that his words troubled my rest that night more than any ghostly visitor or ruined countenance had yet managed to do. Chapter 6. The Man Who Forgot to Die. I had imagined, in my simplicity, that the discovery of Thornfield's name would precipitate an immediate confrontation, and I confess some impatience with Holmes's evident determination to proceed with caution rather than haste. I understand now, with the fuller benefit of hindsight, that his caution arose not from timidity, but from a growing and entirely justified apprehension that we faced an adversary capable of striking at us by means considerably more subtle than the crude violence we might otherwise have anticipated. The first sign came on the morning following our discovery, when Holmes descended to breakfast in a state of quiet but unmistakable disquiet. "Watson," said he, "did you, at any point yesterday, order on my behalf a volume from Hatchard's concerning the mnemonic arts of classical antiquity?" "I did no such thing. Why do you ask?" He said nothing, but crossed to his desk and produced a small, handsomely bound volume, its title stamped in gilt upon the spine, Mnemosyne's Garden, being a treatise upon the ancient arts of memory and their melancholy uses. Within the front cover, in a fine, spidery, unfamiliar hand, was inscribed, "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes," with the compliments of a fellow student of the mind's darker gardens. It arrived this morning by private messenger, with my name upon the parcel and no return direction. I did not order it, Watson, and I do not recall having expressed to any living soul an interest in the subject of mnemonics, and yet here it sits, addressed to me by a hand I do not recognize, upon a subject that lies at the very heart of our present investigation. I confess the matter struck me, at first hearing, as merely curious rather than alarming, a scholar's courtesy perhaps, or an admirer's gift. But Holmes's evident disquiet gave me pause, and worse was to follow within the same hour, for upon returning to his own case notes, laid out upon the desk, precisely as he had left them the previous evening, he discovered that several pages had been subtly rearranged, not removed, nor visibly disturbed, but reordered in a manner so slight that only a mind of Holmes's own exacting precision could have detected the alteration at all. "I arranged these notes myself, not 4 hours before I retired," said he, and there was, for the first time in my long acquaintance with him, a note in his voice that I can only describe as genuine unease. "I arranged them in strict chronological order, as is my invariable habit, and I tell you, Watson, upon my honor, that they do not now stand as I left them. The pages concerning our visit to Limehouse have been placed before those concerning the Cambridge diary, though the diary preceded Limehouse by some 2 days in the actual course of events. A servant, perhaps, tidying in your absence, Mrs. Hudson touches nothing upon this desk, and knows better than to permit any other hand to do so. No, Watson. Someone has entered these rooms, in our absence or while we slept, and has disturbed my papers with sufficient subtlety that I might, upon a less attentive examination, have doubted my own memory of their original arrangement, rather than suspect an intruder's hand. It was this last observation that struck me most forcibly, for I perceived at once the particular cruelty of the design, if design it truly was. A man robbed and burgled knows himself robbed and burgled. But a man whose possessions are merely subtly rearranged is left instead to question his own faculties, to wonder whether he has, in fact, misremembered some trivial arrangement of his own former ordering, and it is precisely this seed of self-doubt, I now understood, that the enemy intended to plant within the one mind in England best equipped to unravel their conspiracy. Holmes, to my very great concern, seemed to grasp this intention even more fully than I did myself, and it visibly shook him. I had known him, over the years, to face down armed men with perfect composure, to endure physical hardship and genuine danger without complaint, but I had never before seen him confront an assault upon the reliability of his own mind, and I watched, with something approaching alarm, as he paced the length of our sitting room with an agitation quite unlike his customary energetic restlessness. "If they can make me doubt the arrangement of a dozen pages," said he, half to himself, "how long before they make me doubt a witness's testimony, or the placement of a clue, or the very sequence of events upon which any sound deduction must depend? A detective's mind is his only true instrument, Watson. Corrupt the instrument, and you need not trouble yourself further with the investigation, for it will defeat itself. Then we must be doubly vigilant. We shall keep a written record, witnessed by us both, of every material fact from this point forward, so that no subtle alteration may pass undetected." "A sound proposal," said Holmes, and I was gratified to see something of his usual decisive energy return to him at the prospect of practical action. "And we shall do more besides. I have long employed, in matters requiring the retention of large bodies of complex information, a method the ancients themselves knew well: the construction of a mental architecture, a palace of memory, in which facts may be stored as securely as valuables in a bank's strong-room, immune to any external tampering, for they exist nowhere but within the mind that built them. I shall teach you the rudiments of this method myself, Watson, this very evening, that we may both possess, between us, a record that no intruder's hand can disturb." I confess I found some comfort in this practical resolution, though the deeper unease of the morning's discovery did not entirely leave me. For if a mind as formidable as Holmes's own could be made, even briefly, to doubt itself, I wondered, though I did not then give the thought full voice, what chance remained for men of lesser faculties, and I wondered too, with a chill I could not wholly suppress, whether the enemy's design extended beyond Holmes alone, to any who stood beside him in this dangerous inquiry. It was that same evening, as we sat late over the construction of Holmes's memory palace, a curious and absorbing exercise, in which I found myself assigning each vital fact of the case to some fixed location within an imagined and elaborately furnished house, that Holmes paused abruptly in the midst of instruction, his pen arrested above the page, and said, in a voice I had not heard him use before, "Watson, I confess a strange presentiment has come upon me this evening, and I do not care for it in the least. Thornfield's gift, the disturbed papers, these are not the acts of a man seeking merely to frighten us from the case. They are the acts of a man testing the ground before he moves. I begin to wonder whether the true target of this conspiracy was never Professor Finch at all, but merely the bait by which a larger and more dangerous quarry might be drawn within reach." "You believe yourself the true target?" He was silent a long moment, his grey eyes fixed upon the fire. "I believe," said he at last, "that I had better hope so, Watson, for if I am wrong, if I am not the quarry they truly seek, then I have not yet begun to imagine who among us stands in far greater danger than I do." Chapter 7. The Root of the Poison. The days that followed Holmes's unsettling presentiment were, I think, among the most singular of our long association, for they combined the outward form of careful, methodical detection with an undercurrent of genuine apprehension that neither of us gave full voice to, though I am certain we each felt it in equal measure. We proceeded, at Holmes's insistence, with redoubled caution. Every fact was now recorded twice, once upon paper, witnessed by us both and locked within Holmes's dispatch box, and once within the growing architecture of the memory palace he had begun to construct, room by imagined room, fact by imagined object, until I confess, I began to find a curious comfort in picturing, whenever some new piece of evidence emerged, precisely where within that phantom house it must now be shelved. It was through my own professional channels, rather than any of Holmes's customary sources, that we came at last to the substance of the poison itself. I had, some years previous, corresponded with a colleague at the Royal College of Physicians upon matters of tropical toxicology arising from my service in Afghanistan, and it was to this gentleman that I now applied, submitting a careful description of the alkaloid I had detected in Professor Finch's tears, together with such symptoms as we had observed. The answer came within 3 days, and it named, with a specificity that struck a chill through me even as I read it, a rare compound derived from a species of fungus found only upon the deep ocean floor of certain Pacific trenches, a substance so scarce, my colleague noted, that its only documented source in England lay within the collections of the Royal Society, brought back some 4 years previous by a deep-sea dredging expedition financed, in significant part, by private subscription among the Society's own fellows. "And who," said Holmes, when I laid this intelligence before him, though I saw from his expression that he had already anticipated my answer, sits upon the governing council that oversees such expeditions and their resulting collections. "Thornfield," I said. "It must be Thornfield." "It must indeed." We have, then, motive suggested by the diary, opportunity suggested by the withdrawn volumes, and now means suggested by this rarest of poisons, all converging upon the same name. I think, Watson, the time for caution has very nearly run its course, and the time for confrontation approaches. But I would know the man himself before I face him, rather than merely the shape of his crimes, and I have arranged, through certain discreet channels, an introduction that will permit us to call upon Professor Thornfield in his own office at Cambridge, under the guise of a scholarly consultation. I, as an amateur historian, seeking his expert opinion upon a disputed manuscript, you, as my medical colleague, accompanying me for the pleasure of the journey. I own that I approached this interview with considerably more trepidation than I permitted myself to show, for I had by now formed, in my imagination, a picture of some grim and calculating villain, and I confess the reality, when it presented itself, unsettled me rather more than any monster of fancy could have done. Professor Silas Thornfield received us in a handsome, book-lined office overlooking one of Cambridge's oldest quadrangles, and proved, in person, a slight, silver-haired gentleman of perhaps 70 years, softly spoken, courteous to a fault, with pale blue eyes that held, I thought, a curious quality of sorrow beneath their evident intelligence. The eyes, I reflected uneasily, of a man who has looked upon some private grief so long that it has become, for him, simply the ordinary colour of the world. "Mr. Holmes," said he, rising to greet us with every appearance of genuine pleasure, "and Dr. Watson, I confess I am delighted, and not a little flattered, that a consulting detective of your considerable reputation should trouble himself to seek my humble opinion upon a manuscript. Do sit, I beg you, and tell me what puzzle has brought you so far from London." Holmes proceeded, with an actor's skill I have rarely seen him surpass, to describe a wholly fictitious disputed charter, drawing Thornfield into a discussion of medieval provenance that lasted, by my pocket watch, some 25 minutes, during which the old scholar displayed a depth of learning and a warmth of manner that, I confess, made the accusations forming in my own mind seem, for whole stretches of that conversation, almost fantastical. It was only as our interview drew toward its natural close that Thornfield's manner underwent a subtle but unmistakable change. Nothing so crude as a start of guilt or a falter of speech, but a settling rather into a quieter and more watchful stillness, as a man might settle who understands, at last, that the conversation he has been enjoying was never truly about the subject discussed. "I confess, Mr. Holmes," said he, folding his soft, ink-stained hands upon the desk before him, "that I have followed with some interest the recent disappearance and, I understand, recovery of poor Aldrich Finch, a tragic case." He was, in his way, a most gifted scholar, though his final researches led him, I fear, into waters considerably deeper and colder than he was equipped to navigate. "You knew him well?" Holmes inquired, his tone unchanged, though I saw his eyes had sharpened. "As well as any man in this university, I should think." "I was, indeed, just this morning reading your good friend's latest monograph in the medical journals, Dr. Watson. A case concerning some singular affliction of the nervous system, was it not? Most forgettable, I confess, though I intend no discourtesy by the observation. Memory, gentlemen, is a curious and fickle instrument. We remember what wounds us, and forget, all too readily, what does not." There was, in the old man's soft, precisely measured words, an unmistakable undertone that I could not immediately name, though Holmes, I saw, understood it at once, for his posture, already still, grew stiller yet, as a hunting animal grows still upon first scenting its quarry, or, I thought with sudden unease, upon first scenting the hunter that stalks it in turn. "You speak, Professor," said Holmes slowly, "as a man who has given considerable private thought to the subject of memory and its uses." "I have given it," said Thornfield, and here, for the first time, something in his pale eyes shifted, opened, as though a door long closed had been permitted, deliberately, to swing ajar, the whole of a long lifetime's thought, Mr. Holmes. "I wonder, indeed, whether you and I might not find, upon that particular subject, a great deal more in common than either of us has yet supposed." Chapter 8. A History of Silence. He rose as he spoke these final words, and crossed to a tall cabinet set against the far wall of his office, from which he produced, with the unhurried ceremony of a man long accustomed to command, a small crystal decanter and 2 glasses. "You will not, I think, refuse an old man a moment's honesty, Mr. Holmes, now that the pleasantries have run their course. I know why you have come. I have known, in truth, since the very evening our friend Finch first found his way to your door, that this hour must eventually arrive, and I confess I have looked forward to it, in my quieter moments, with something very near to anticipation. It is a rare pleasure, at my age, to converse at last with a mind that need not be spoken to in riddles or half-truths." "Then let us speak plainly," said Holmes, and though his voice remained level, I saw that his hand, resting upon the arm of his chair, had closed with a tension he did not trouble to disguise from me, whatever face he presented to our host. "You are the Grand Archivist of the Chimerian Order." "I am," said Thornfield simply, and poured the wine with a steady hand, though I confess the title has always struck me as somewhat theatrical for what is, at its heart, a very simple philosophy, imperfectly understood even by many of my own colleagues within the order. "We do not worship darkness, Mr. Holmes, whatever lurid picture your investigations may have painted of us. We worship, if the word is not too strong, release. Release from what? From history, sir. From the tyranny of the past. Thornfield settled once more into his chair, and I saw, as he spoke, the sorrow I had earlier detected in his pale eyes deepen into something rawer, more personal. You will have discovered, I do not doubt, that I lost my wife and my only son some 30 years ago, in a fire that consumed our family home, a fire whose true origin lay not in accident, as the official record states, but in a feud between our family and another, a feud whose roots reached back some 4 generations, over a boundary dispute so ancient that neither family, by the time of the fire, could any longer clearly recall its original cause. My wife and son died, Mr. Holmes, for a grievance that no living man could properly explain, inherited across a century like some poisoned legacy passed from father to son, and I have spent every year since that night asking myself a single question: what freedom might mankind know, were it not shackled, generation upon generation, to griefs and hatreds it has long since ceased to understand, yet cannot bring itself to release? And your answer, said Holmes quietly, was to inflict upon others the very oblivion you yourself cannot achieve, for your own grief. Thornfield's face, at this, showed the first genuine flash of pain I had yet observed in him. Not anger, but something closer to a wound reopened. You perceive the irony precisely, Mr. Holmes, and I will not insult your intelligence by denying it. I cannot forget my wife's face, nor my son's laugh, though God knows I have tried, in every hour of every day these 30 years, to set that memory down and walk free of it. I am a prisoner of my own philosophy, and I have concluded, in my old age, that if I cannot achieve for myself the peace I believe humanity deserves, I might yet grant it to others, beginning, in Finch's case, with the erasure of a single dangerous truth that threatened to plunge an entire nation back into precisely the sort of ancient, inherited grievance that destroyed my family. The forged charter, a forged foundation stone beneath the whole edifice of the royal succession, yes, a fact that, were it ever proven and published, would furnish every disaffected faction in this kingdom with a historical grievance to nurse and inflame for another century of bloodshed. Finch would not be persuaded to let the matter rest. I offered him, in the end, the same gift I now offer you, Mr. Holmes, a release from the burden of a truth too dangerous to carry and too painful in its way ever to set down. He rose again and crossed to stand before the tall window of his office, his slight figure outlined against the grey Cambridge sky. I offer it to you now, in all sincerity. You are a man tormented, I think, by memories of your own, failures, regrets, perhaps some old struggle you have never fully conquered. I could grant you freedom from all of it, Mr. Holmes, a mind wiped clean of every old wound, unburdened at last of the endless cataloguing that has surely by now become as much a prison to you as a gift. I confess that in the silence that followed, I watched Holmes's face with an anxiety I have rarely felt in all our years together, for I saw upon it, for the briefest of instants, something I had never before observed there, a flicker of genuine temptation, swiftly suppressed but unmistakably present, as though some private grief of his own, of which even I knew nothing, had for one moment risen up and considered, however briefly, the terrible mercy being offered. Then it passed, and Holmes's grey eyes hardened once more into their familiar, unyielding clarity. You mistake me, Professor, if you imagine that pain and memory are burdens to be set down like some traveller's excess baggage. I am made of my failures as surely as I am made of my successes, and I would no more surrender them than I would surrender my own name. You have built, out of one man's unbearable grief, a philosophy that mistakes amputation for healing. I decline your gift, and I tell you further that I intend to see your order dismantled, and Professor Finch's stolen faculties, so far as medicine permits, restored to him. Thornfield turned from the window, and I saw upon his soft, aged face an expression of genuine, unfeigned regret, though nothing, I thought, resembling surrender. "I had hoped," said he quietly, "that a mind such as yours might understand what lesser men cannot. It grieves me, truly, that you refuse me. But I confess, Mr. Holmes, that I had not entirely expected you to accept, and I have made, in consequence, other provision for our continued discourse." He paused, and something in the stillness of that pause struck me with sudden dread before ever he spoke his next words. "The past, you say, is a burden a great man must learn to carry. Very well. But your good friend Dr. Watson here, forgive me, Doctor, I intend no cruelty by the observation, is not, I think, a man whose absence from the historical record the world would greatly mourn nor greatly notice. A forgettable man, if you will permit the phrase, makes for the most perfect and seamless of erasures. He shall be, I think, our order's greatest triumph yet, and you, Mr. Holmes, shall have the singular experience of discovering precisely what it means to lose, not your own memories, but the memories another man carries of you." I felt in that moment a cold quite unlike any I had known even upon the bitter passes of Afghanistan, and I saw Holmes rise from his chair with a speed and violence of motion that overturned, unheeded, the wine Thornfield had poured for him. "You will not touch him," said Holmes, and his voice, low and utterly without its habitual irony, frightened me more than any shout could have done. But Thornfield only smiled, with the terrible, gentle sorrow of a man who has long since made his peace with whatever cruelty his philosophy demands of him, and rang a small bell upon his desk. "I fear, Mr. Holmes," said he softly, as the door behind us opened to admit two broad-shouldered men I had not observed waiting in the outer corridor, "that the matter is already very largely settled. Brother Alderman collected your good doctor's diary from his lodgings some 2 hours ago, while you and I have been enjoying our most illuminating conversation. A small volume, I understand, recording the private thoughts and memories of a full year of your friendship. It burns even now, I should imagine, in the grate of our house at Limehouse, and Dr. Watson himself will follow it there within the hour, that we may begin, with all the gentleness our methods permit, the necessary work of his forgetting. Chapter 9. A New Face for a New World. I will not pretend, in setting down this final chapter, that I recall with perfect clarity every particular of what followed, for the 2 hours succeeding Thornfield's terrible pronouncement passed for me in a haze of fear such as I have rarely known even under enemy fire. But I recall enough, and Holmes has since supplied what I could not myself observe, that I may give a true and honest account of how the matter ended. I was taken, with little ceremony and less gentleness than Thornfield's soft words had promised, by the 2 men summoned to his office, and conveyed by closed carriage, my protests silenced by a cloth, soaked in some sweetish, stupefying chemical, held firmly over my face, back toward London, and thence, as I would later learn, to the damp cellars beneath the Limehouse asylum we had visited under false pretenses scarcely a week before. Holmes, meanwhile, and it is here that I must rely entirely upon his own account, given to me afterward with a candour that cost him, I think, no small effort of will, found himself, for perhaps the only time in the whole of our long partnership, genuinely uncertain of his own next action. "I confess to you now, Watson," he told me some days later, "that in the moment Thornfield's men bore you from that office, I very nearly made the gravest error of my career. My first thought, my only thought, was to give chase directly, without plan or preparation, and I was saved from that folly only by the old man's own vanity, for he could not resist, even in that moment of apparent triumph, explaining to me at some length the precise nature of the antidote required to reverse the fungal toxin's effects, believing, I think, that the knowledge would torment me the more thoroughly for being useless without your recovery. It was this vanity, in the end, that undid him. For Holmes, forcing himself, by what discipline I can scarcely imagine, into a semblance of calm, pressed Thornfield further upon the antidote's precise botanical source, learning that the rare flowering plant required to counter the poison's effects grew, in all of England, only in the marshy ground immediately surrounding the Limehouse establishment itself, cultivated there, in a bitter irony Thornfield seemed almost to relish, specifically to treat those few of the Order's own experiments that had proceeded too far and threatened to become inconveniently permanent. Holmes, thus armed with the location of both antidote and prisoner, did not proceed alone. He summoned, by a swiftly dispatched telegram, Inspector Lestrade, whom he had until that point kept largely at the margins of the investigation, and it was with a full complement of Scotland Yard constables, arriving at Limehouse within the very hour that I was carried, still insensible, into that damp and terrible cellar, that Holmes burst at last through the asylum's rear entrance. I woke, this much I do recall with perfect clarity, and shall carry with me, I think, to the end of my own days, to find myself strapped upon a low wooden table in a chamber lit by a single guttering lamp, the walls weeping with the same damp I had noted upon our first visit, and Brother Alderman standing over me with a small glass vial, his soft clergyman's face arranged in an expression of gentle, terrible pity. "It will not hurt, Doctor," he was saying, in a voice I can still hear if I close my eyes and permit myself to remember it. "It will not hurt at all. You will simply cease, by degrees, to be troubled by any of it." I could not move. I could not, in that moment, even properly form the shape of my own fear into coherent thought, and I understood, with a clarity that has haunted my dreams since, something of the terror that poor Professor Finch himself must have known in his own final hour of ordinary consciousness. It was at this precise moment, and I have since told Holmes that I shall never, in the whole remainder of my life, forget the sound of it, that the cellar door was struck from its hinges, and Holmes's voice, raised in a fury I had never before heard from him, filled that terrible chamber. "Watson, can you hear me?" I could not answer him in words, but I turned my head, and I believe that small motion alone was answer enough, for I heard him cross the room in 3 strides, heard Brother Alderman's vial shatter upon the stone floor as Holmes struck it from his hand, and felt, a moment later, the cords about my wrists give way beneath a knife's swift cut. "He has not yet been dosed," Holmes said, and I heard in his voice, even through the fog of my own returning senses, something that I recognized, with a strange and private wonder, as relief so profound, it very nearly broke through the whole of his customary composure. "Lestrade, the flower, in the beds beyond the eastern wall, exactly as Thornfield described it. Bring it to me at once, and bring also whatever remains of the antidote already prepared within this building, for I do not know how many others may yet be saved by it." The following hours passed for me in a confusion of lamplight and hurried voices, of Holmes's steady hand at my shoulder, and Lestrade's constables moving through those damp corridors with a thoroughness that did, I think, some credit to Scotland Yard's methods, however slow they had been to recognize the case's true dimensions. Thornfield himself was taken that same night at his Cambridge office, offering no resistance whatsoever, and Brother Alderman, whose true name, we later learned, was one Josiah Prentice, a defrocked clergyman of genuinely wretched history, was apprehended within the asylum itself before he could effect any further harm. The antidote, administered to me within that same night, proved, I record this with the gratitude of a man who has since made a most complete recovery, entirely effective, for I had been spared the full dosing that had claimed poor Professor Finch across many months of gradual, deliberate erasure. I lost, in the end, only a portion of that final terrible day's memory, which has never fully returned to me, and which I do not, upon reflection, greatly mourn. Professor Finch himself proved a more melancholy matter. The same antidote, administered to him under my own careful medical supervision over the weeks that followed, restored to him, by slow and painful degrees, the power of sight and hearing and speech, and something, too, of his ravaged features, though I will not pretend the restoration was ever complete. Nor that the year of his captivity, for captivity it had been, in circumstances we pieced together only gradually from the Order's own seized correspondence, kept in some secondary establishment of the Order's before his final desperate escape, could ever be wholly returned to him. His memory of his own past life came back to him only in fragments, like pieces of a shattered vase, imperfectly reassembled. And Cecily Finch, God bless her patient devotion, has since told me that her father remains, to this day, a man somewhat changed from the one she knew before, quieter, more given to long silences, but capable, at last, of recognizing his own daughter's face and speaking, however haltingly, her name. Thornfield's trial, when it came, proved a curious and largely private affair, for the Crown's own lawyers, I understand, took considerable pains to keep from public record any detailed account of the Order's true purposes, fearing, not without reason, the very sort of dangerous notoriety that might attend so singular and philosophically arresting a conspiracy. He was confined, in the end, to an institution for the criminally insane, though I confess I have never been entirely persuaded that madness, in the ordinary sense, was ever the proper description of his crime. He died there some 3 years later, and Holmes, who visited him upon one occasion shortly before his death, told me only that the old man had, by then, forgotten a very great deal of his own life's work, whether through the natural erosions of age or through some final and bitter irony of a mind turning at last upon itself. Neither Holmes nor his physicians could say with certainty. I asked Holmes, some weeks after the whole affair had reached its official conclusion, whether he had felt, in that terrible cellar, any true fear that he might arrive too late. He was silent a long while before answering, and when he spoke, it was with a gravity I had rarely heard from him, even upon the conclusion of our gravest cases. I have faced, in the course of our work together, Watson, a great many dangers to my own person, and I confess I have rarely given them more than passing thought. For a man's own death, however unwelcome, holds a certain simplicity that other losses do not share. But I discovered, in that carriage ride to Limehouse, a fear of an altogether different character. The fear not of losing you, but of surviving your loss with the full and permanent knowledge of every particular circumstance that led to it, unable, ever, to set that knowledge down. You feared remembering rather than forgetting. I feared remembering everything, and I feared, too, for one dark moment in Thornfield's office, the terrible temptation of forgetting nothing being asked of me at all, merely offered, as a mercy, the chance to lay down every old grief I have ever carried. I understood, in refusing him, something I had not fully grasped before, that a man's memories, however painful, are not a prison to be escaped, but the very foundation upon which whatever decency he possesses is built. Thornfield sought to spare the world its pain by unmaking its capacity to remember that pain at all, and in doing so, he unmade also its capacity for compassion, for loyalty, for love. For what, after all, is love, Watson, but a memory we choose, each day, to carry forward? Professor Finch, in the slow months of his recovery, asked me once, in those halting, painfully rebuilt sentences that had cost him so many weeks of patient effort to reconstruct, whether Holmes had ever doubted, in the course of the investigation, that he would be found and saved at all. I did not think it my place to answer for Holmes, and so I put the question to him directly, that same evening, as we sat before our familiar fire at Baker Street, the case at last fully closed, and its papers filed away among the many others that crowd his tin dispatch boxes. "Did you remember me, Holmes?" I asked him, half in jest, though I confess the question carried, beneath its lightness, a weight I had not fully intended, throughout that whole dark business. "Did you ever, even for a moment, permit yourself to imagine I might be lost?" Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his pipe forgotten in his hand, his grey eyes fixed upon the fire, with an expression I had seen upon his face, perhaps only twice before, in all our years together, an expression wholly without irony, wholly without the customary armour of his intellect. "Always, my friend," said he simply, and returned after a moment to his pipe, as though the words themselves had cost him more than he cared to spend further upon their elaboration. "I have set down this account, as I have set down so many others, in the private conviction that some cases deserve to be remembered not for the cleverness of their solution alone, but for the deeper truths they illuminate along the way. Thornfield believed the past a tyranny from which mankind must one day free itself. I have come, in the years since, to believe rather the opposite, that it is precisely our stubborn, imperfect, sometimes painful faculty of memory that binds us, each to each, in whatever fragile decency we manage to preserve, against a world too often eager to forget. The Chimerian Order was broken that autumn, its papers seized, its remaining members scattered or silenced by the quiet pressure of men who preferred the matter never reach a public court. But Holmes has told me, upon more than one occasion since, that he does not believe such philosophies die so easily as their adherents. Somewhere, he says, in some quiet library or gentleman's club, another mind, broken by private grief, is even now constructing some new and equally seductive argument for forgetting. "We are the guardians of memory, Watson," he said to me, upon the last evening of that strange and terrible case, looking at his own reflection in the darkened window glass, as though seeking there some confirmation of his own words, and that is a burden we must never lay down. I have thought of those words often in the years since, and I have come to believe them true, not as a burden merely, but as the very substance of whatever love and loyalty we owe to one another, carried forward, day upon day, against a world that would too easily let it go.